sensitive! She's helping!
Call a medical alert!
Please don't. She's all I have.
Homeless veteran, tasered with his service dog for panhandling. The outcome will break your heart. The cardboard sign trembled in Staff Sergeant Joshua Martinez's weathered hands as he stood on the traffic median at the intersection of 4th and Main. The words, "Iraq veteran, anything helps, God bless," barely legible after 3 months of rain and sun. Beside him, his golden retriever service dog Sunshine sat with patient dignity, her official vest faded, but her alert posture unmistakable to anyone who understood working animals versus pets. What Joshua didn't know was that Sandra Williams, sitting in her Mercedes at the red light, was already dialing 911 with righteous indignation. There's a man on the median using a dog to guilt people into giving him money, she reported with the certainty of someone who'd never lost everything to invisible wounds. It's clearly a scam, and it's dangerous having animals in traffic. In exactly 17 minutes, 2 police officers would arrive with assumptions that would destroy the only family Joshua had left, while a horrified community watched their failure to protect the very veteran who had protected them. Riverside, California, 2025. The mid-sized city of 120,000 residents sat in the shadow of growing wealth inequality, where tech workers' mansions existed blocks away from homeless encampments that housed increasing numbers of veterans whose invisible disabilities had led to unemployment, family breakdown, and the kind of social invisibility that made panhandling feel like the only option for survival. Staff Sergeant Joshua Martinez embodied the devastating consequences of war that civilian America preferred not to see. His 38 years carrying trauma from 3 deployments to Iraq, where his infantry unit had endured constant IED attacks, sniper fire, and the kind of hypervigilance that kept soldiers alive in combat zones, but made civilian life feel perpetually dangerous and unpredictable. The PTSD that had ended his military career manifested in night terrors, severe anxiety in crowds, and the social disconnection that had cost him his marriage, his children's custody, and eventually his job as a warehouse supervisor when panic attacks made regular employment impossible. The VA disability payments that should have supported him were delayed in bureaucratic limbo, leaving him stranded between military service and civilian benefits, while his savings evaporated and his housing became unaffordable. Sunshine represented the one relationship that had survived Joshua's psychological collapse, a golden retriever whose 2 years of specialized training had cost the VA $35,000, and whose therapeutic partnership was the difference between Joshua functioning minimally and disappearing completely into the kind of despair that claimed 22 veterans daily through suicide. Her tasks included detecting the onset of panic attacks through biochemical changes, providing deep pressure therapy during PTSD episodes, creating protective barriers when crowds triggered his hypervigilance, and performing the room searches that satisfied his combat condition need to clear spaces before feeling secure enough to rest or relax. Their life on the streets had begun 6 months earlier when Joshua's disability appeals were denied and his apartment eviction became final. Their survival depending on the generosity of strangers who saw a homeless veteran rather than a decorated soldier whose service had earned him 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star that now lay forgotten in a storage unit he could no longer afford. The median strip at 4th and Main had become their daily station, not from choice but from necessity, a location that provided visibility to potential donors while keeping them separated from the sidewalk crowds that triggered Joshua's worst PTSD symptoms. The spot was legal according to city ordinances, though the reality of their presence challenged comfortable assumptions about homelessness and military service. Officers David Thompson and Maria Santos represented the institutional gaps in police training that left law enforcement unprepared to distinguish between criminal activity and the survival strategies of disabled veterans whose accommodation needs were invisible to untrained observers. Thompson's 15 years with Riverside PD had taught him to view panhandling as quality of life issue requiring enforcement, while Santos's 5 years had provided minimal education about service animals or veteran disabilities. The broader context was a community where military service was honored in abstract but misunderstood in practice, where homeless veterans were viewed as public relations problems rather than citizens whose service had earned accommodation and support. The intersection of homelessness, disability, and law enforcement created perfect conditions for civil rights violations that could destroy lives while traumatizing communities forced to witness their failures. Sandra Williams embodied the privilege that allowed some citizens to view desperation as deception. Her comfortable life having never required understanding of the complex factors that could transform decorated combat veterans into homeless panhandlers whose only crime was seeking survival assistance from fellow Americans. The collision between Joshua's vulnerability and institutional ignorance was building toward a tragedy that would test whether a community's proclaimed support for veterans meant anything when confronted with the uncomfortable realities of how military service could destroy rather than enhance civilian life. The morning had begun with Joshua's careful routine of preparing for another day of seeking assistance that kept him and Sunshine alive, checking her water bowl, ensuring her service vest was properly positioned, and reviewing the spots where drivers might show compassion for a veteran whose struggles were largely invisible to passing traffic. Sunshine work mode, Joshua commanded quietly as they positioned themselves on the familiar median strip. His service dog immediately shifting into the alert posture that indicated she was monitoring his stress levels, while remaining prepared to provide intervention if his PTSD symptoms escalated beyond manageable levels. The cardboard sign was their only form of communication with a world that had largely forgotten them. Its simple message attempting to bridge the gap between Joshua's military service and his current desperation while maintaining the dignity that his combat experience had taught him to preserve even in the most difficult circumstances. The intersection provided steady but modest assistance drivers who offered dollar bills, occasionally larger donations, and the kind of brief human contact that reminded Joshua that some people still cared about veterans even when institutions had failed them. Sunshine's presence wasn't calculated manipulation, but essential medical equipment that kept him functional enough to seek help, rather than surrendering to the suicidal thoughts that haunted his worst moments. The first sign of trouble came when Joshua noticed Sandra Williams gesturing angrily in his direction while speaking into her phone, her body language suggesting moral outrage rather than concern for his welfare. His military training had taught him to recognize hostile intent, and her behavior indicated that help was not what she was summoning. "Someone's calling the cops," Joshua whispered to Sunshine, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd learned that being a veteran provided no protection from civilian prejudice or institutional ignorance. "We might need to move, girl. This could get bad fast." But their departure was prevented by the traffic patterns that made leaving the median dangerous during rush hour, trapping them in a location that was about to become a confrontation zone between Joshua's survival needs and law enforcement officers whose training had never addressed the intersection of homelessness, disability, and veteran status. The arrival of Officers Thompson and Santos was tactical rather than investigative, their approach suggesting they'd been briefed to expect problematic behavior rather than a disabled veteran seeking assistance through legal means. Their positioning created exactly the kind of authority confrontation that Joshua's PTSD made unbearable while triggering Sunshine's protective instincts. "Sir, we've received complaints about aggressive panhandling and the use of animals to solicit money," Officer Thompson announced without introduction or inquiry about Joshua's situation, his tone suggesting predetermined conclusions rather than fact-finding mission. "We need to see identification and documentation for that animal." Joshua's response was respectful but firm, drawing on military training that emphasized proper procedures with authority figures while protecting essential resources. "Officers, I'm Joshua Martinez, Army veteran. This is Sunshine, my service dog trained to assist with my combat-related PTSD. I have all required documentation and we're not violating any city ordinances." The paperwork he offered was comprehensive and legally unassailable: VA disability determination letters, Sunshine's training certificates from an approved program, and medical necessity statements that proved their partnership was therapeutic rather than fraudulent. The documentation exceeded legal requirements while establishing his legitimacy as disabled veteran seeking assistance. But Officer Santos's reaction revealed institutional prejudice that treated homeless individuals as inherently dishonest, regardless of documentation. "Anyone can buy service dog vests online and fake paperwork. We've seen it all before. That dog looks like a regular pet being used to generate sympathy money from unsuspecting drivers." The accusation was both insulting and dangerous, questioning the integrity of a decorated combat veteran while dismissing medical equipment that kept him functional enough to survive civilian life. Joshua's attempt to maintain composure was complicated by rising stress levels that Sunshine was trained to detect and interrupt. "Officers, I understand concerns about fraud, but Sunshine is legitimate medical equipment. I'm happy to demonstrate her training or provide additional verification if needed." Joshua replied with the patience that street survival had taught him to maintain despite institutional hostility. The confrontation escalated when Officer Thompson decided that Joshua's homelessness itself was evidence of fraudulent behavior. His assumption that legitimate veterans couldn't become homeless, revealing ignorance about the realities of PTSD disability bureaucracy and the civilian transition challenges that had left thousands of combat veterans living on America's streets. "If you're really a disabled veteran, why aren't you getting benefits instead of panhandling?" Thompson demanded, with the kind of question that demonstrated complete ignorance about VA bureaucracy, appeals processes, and the months or years that disability claims could remain unresolved while veterans struggled to survive. "Real disabled vets get taken care of by the system." Joshua's explanation revealed the painful reality that civilian America preferred not to acknowledge that military service could create disabilities that were difficult to prove, that VA bureaucracy could delay essential benefits while veterans faced homelessness, and that the gap between military discharge and civilian stability could destroy lives regardless of service record or decoration. My disability claim has been under appeal for 18 months. While the VA disputes my PTSD diagnosis, Joshua explained with the exhausted patience of someone who'd repeated this story countless times to skeptical authorities. Sunshine keeps me functional enough to survive while I wait for the system to acknowledge that 3 deployments left me with trauma that makes normal employment impossible. But Officer Santos interpreted Joshua's detailed explanation as evidence of a rehearsed scam rather than genuine hardship. That's exactly what we'd expect someone running a panhandling operation to say. You've got answers for everything, and that dog's been trained to look pathetic to increase donations. The misunderstanding was both tragic and dangerous, with law enforcement officers treating survival strategies as criminal behavior while viewing medical equipment as fraudulent props. Sunshine's calm professionalism was being interpreted as evidence of manipulation rather than proof of legitimate training and therapeutic necessity. The crisis deepened when Joshua, overwhelmed by hostile questioning and the public humiliation of having his service record challenged, began experiencing the physiological symptoms that indicated an approaching PTSD episode. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his hands started trembling, and his peripheral vision began tunneling as combat memories merged with present circumstances. Sunshine's response was immediate and professional. The golden retriever moving into position to provide stability and deep pressure therapy, while emitting the low vocalizations that her training had taught her to use for alerting others to her handler's medical distress. Her behavior was textbook service dog intervention, but to officers ignorant about disability accommodation, it appeared to confirm assumptions about trained begging behaviors. See how the dog performs on command to make him look more sympathetic. Santos pointed out to her partner her misinterpretation of medical intervention, revealing training gaps that transformed life-saving assistance into evidence of criminal activity. This is exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud operation we've been warned about. The situation reached critical mass when Thompson decided that Joshua's PTSD episode was resistance to authority, requiring physical control. His grab for Joshua's arm, triggering exactly the kind of unexpected physical contact that military medical professionals had identified as dangerous for combat veterans with severe trauma responses. You're coming with us for questioning about fraudulent service animal claims and aggressive panhandling, Thompson announced as he moved to arrest Joshua, his physical approach activating both the veteran's combat conditioning and his service dog's protective training in ways that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Joshua's reaction was instinctive and trauma-driven, his military training asserting itself as he pulled away from unexpected physical contact that his damaged nervous system interpreted as hostile action requiring defensive response. His movement wasn't criminal resistance, but psychological survival, the kind of automatic reaction that kept soldiers alive in combat zones, but criminalized them in civilian encounters. Sunshine's training had taught her to protect her handler during medical emergencies, and Joshua's PTSD episode, combined with unexpected physical confrontation, triggered every protective instinct that 2 years of conditioning had developed. Her positioning between Joshua and the officers was professional medical intervention, but her protective stance appeared threatening to law enforcement officers whose training emphasized dominance over accommodation. "The dog's becoming aggressive," Santos shouted as she drew her taser, her threat assessment based on complete ignorance about service dog behavior during medical emergencies. "It's protecting him while he resists arrest. We need to neutralize both threats before this gets worse." Joshua's desperate attempt to explain Sunshine's medical function was hampered by his deteriorating psychological condition, his words becoming fragmented as the PTSD episode that his service dog was trying to manage overwhelmed his cognitive processing. "She's helping. Medical alert. Please don't hurt her. She's all I have." But Thompson's interpretation was that Joshua's distress proved the dangerous nature of both man and animal. "He's using the dog as a weapon while claiming it's medical equipment. We're not falling for this manipulation. Time to end this situation before someone gets hurt." The moment of maximum crisis was approaching as both officers prepared to use electrical weapons against a disabled veteran and his service dog. Their ignorance about PTSD service animal law and veteran accommodation rights, creating the perfect storm for tragedy that would devastate multiple lives while shocking a community into recognizing how badly they had failed someone who had served them. The catastrophic assault began when Officer Santos discharged her taser into both Joshua and Sunshine, simultaneously 50,000 volts coursing through man and dog as they collapsed together on the traffic median, while the lunch hour crowd witnessed something unprecedented: a homeless veteran and his service dog being electrocuted for the crime of seeking assistance to survive another day. The electrical current disrupted Sunshine's nervous system while triggering a complete PTSD breakdown in Joshua, whose combat-damaged brain interpreted the assault as life-threatening attack, requiring the kind of survival responses that had kept him alive in Iraq, but would now be used as evidence of criminal behavior by officers who had created the very crisis they claimed to be controlling. "Sunshine, no, no, no," Joshua screamed as he watched his service dog convulse from electrical trauma, his voice carrying the same anguish he'd felt watching Marines die under fire, the woman who had kept him alive for 2 years now suffering because his need for survival had put her in danger from people who were supposed to protect and serve. The immediate aftermath was chaos, as Sunshine, disoriented and terrified by the electrical assault, broke free from the officer's attempts to restrain her and fled into 4th Street traffic, while her nervous system struggled to process the trauma that had disrupted both her physical coordination and her trained responses to emergency situations. "Get the dog," Officer Thompson shouted as Sunshine stumbled into the intersection, her golden coat visible against the asphalt as she moved erratically between vehicles whose drivers were trying to avoid hitting an obviously injured animal whose handler was being brutalized by police officers on the nearby median strip. The collision was inevitable and devastating. A delivery truck whose driver had no time to react struck Sunshine at 35 miles per hour, her body thrown 15 feet as Joshua's anguished screams pierced the California afternoon. The service dog, who had detected his seizures, interrupted his nightmares and provided the only unconditional love he'd known since returning from war, was dying in a gutter while he lay handcuffed and helpless to reach her. "You killed her. You killed my dog," Joshua sobbed as he fought against restraints that prevented him from reaching Sunshine, whose labored breathing indicated internal injuries that would prove fatal despite the veterinary assistance that horrified bystanders were desperately summoning. She was all I had. She was keeping me alive. The scene that unfolded was captured by dozens of cell phones as witnesses documented something that challenged every assumption about law enforcement, veteran support, and basic human decency. The footage would show a decorated combat veteran being tortured for seeking assistance, while his service dog died as direct result of police brutality that had transformed medical emergency into criminal matter. Driver Jennifer Walsh, who had stopped to help, provided testimony that would prove crucial for subsequent investigations. That dog wasn't aggressive. She was trying to help a man who was obviously having some kind of medical episode. The police created the whole situation by attacking someone who was just standing there with a sign asking for help. The medical response revealed the devastating extent of trauma inflicted on both victims, with paramedics documenting electrical injuries that had exacerbated Joshua's existing neurological damage, while veterinary emergency technicians confirmed that Sunshine's internal injuries from the traffic collision were too severe for survival. Dr. Patricia Kim, the emergency veterinarian who attempted to save Sunshine, provided professional assessment that would become evidence in federal prosecutions. This animal suffered electrical trauma that caused disorientation and panic, leading directly to the traffic accident that caused her fatal injuries. The neurological damage from the taser deployment made it impossible for her to respond to traffic safely. The darkest moment came when Sunshine died in Joshua's arms. After officers finally allowed him to reach her, her service vest still bearing the patches that identified her as medical equipment rather than pet, while her handler experienced the complete psychological collapse that 2 years of partnership had been preventing through her presence and trained intervention. She saved my life every day, and they killed her for doing her job. Joshua whispered through tears that mixed grief with rage, his words captured by media cameras that had arrived to document what was already being recognized as one of the most clear-cut cases of police brutality against disabled veterans in recent memory. The institutional response was predictably defensive, with Riverside Police Department issuing statements that described the incident as appropriate use of force against non-compliant individual with aggressive animal language that ignored video evidence showing peaceful panhandling interrupted by unnecessary escalation that had killed an innocent service dog. The community's moral crisis was immediate and profound, as residents confronted footage that showed their police force had tortured a homeless veteran and caused his service dog's death for the crime of seeking assistance that kept him alive while bureaucracy delayed the benefits his military service had earned. The viral spread of the incident created national outrage that transcended political boundaries, with millions of Americans witnessing clear evidence that the gap between proclaimed veteran support and actual veteran treatment had become a chasm that could literally kill the people and animals who served them. The transformation began when Marine Corps veteran and U.S. Congressman Robert Chen arrived in Riverside within 24 hours of Sunshine's death. His military background and congressional authority creating exactly the kind of high-level intervention that could force accountability for civil rights violations that local authorities might otherwise minimize or ignore. What happened to Staff Sergeant Martinez and his service dog represents a complete failure of our society's obligation to those who served in uniform. Congressman Chen announced during a press conference held at the intersection where Sunshine had died. A decorated combat veteran was tortured and his medical equipment destroyed by officers whose ignorance about disability law and veteran rights created a tragedy that demands federal investigation and comprehensive reform. The congressional intervention elevated the incident from local police misconduct to federal civil rights violation, requiring Department of Justice response with Civil Rights Division attorneys arriving to investigate crimes so clearly documented that denial was impossible and prosecution inevitable. But the most powerful transformation came from Riverside's veteran community, whose mobilization was swift and comprehensive as hundreds of former service members recognized that Joshua's treatment represented systematic failures that threatened every veteran whose disabilities made them vulnerable to institutional prejudice and violence. "This could have been any of us," declared Vietnam veteran Patricia Rodriguez during the vigil held for Sunshine at the intersection where she died. Joshua's crime was being homeless and disabled, and his punishment was watching police torture and kill the only family he had left. This city has blood on its hands, and we're not letting them wash it off with excuses. The community response transcended military lines as civilians who had witnessed the incident organized support that included legal assistance housing for Joshua and medical care for trauma that extended far beyond his original combat injuries. The coalition was powerful because it combined moral outrage with practical action that addressed both individual needs and systemic failures. The legal response was immediate and devastating for the officers involved, with federal prosecutors charging Thompson and Santos with civil rights violations, excessive force, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional rights. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 15 years in prison for crimes that video evidence made undeniable. The assault on Staff Sergeant Martinez and the destruction of his service animal represent willful violation of federal disability law and veteran accommodation rights, announced U.S. Attorney Michael Harrison during the federal indictment announcement. The video evidence documents crimes that demand maximum prosecution to send clear messages about accountability for those who violate constitutional rights. Joshua's recovery was complicated by grief that extended beyond normal loss to encompass the destruction of the therapeutic relationship that had kept him functional for 2 years. The trauma of watching Sunshine die as direct result of his survival needs created guilt and despair that required intensive intervention from VA mental health professionals who understood combat trauma and service animal partnerships. The breakthrough came when the Riverside Veterans Coalition, led by Congressman Chen's office, provided Joshua with temporary housing while connecting him with legal representation that would pursue both criminal justice and civil remedies for the violations he'd suffered. Their support created stability that allowed him to process trauma while participating in accountability efforts. Joshua's case isn't just about one veteran. It's about whether this country honors its promises to those who served. Chen explained during congressional hearings that examined the intersection of homelessness, disability, and law enforcement treatment of veterans. His service dog died because officers were more concerned with removing him from public view than understanding his rights and needs. The institutional changes were comprehensive and swift, with Riverside implementing emergency reforms that included mandatory veteran accommodation training for all police officers, partnership with local VS services for homeless veteran outreach, and specialized protocols for interactions involving service animals and disabled individuals. The policy changes extended statewide as California Governor Maria Santos signed the Sunshine's Law package, creating criminal penalties for interference with service animals while mandating law enforcement training on disability accommodation and veteran rights. The legislation was bipartisan and overwhelming, reflecting public outrage that transcended political boundaries. But the most meaningful change was personal rather than institutional, with Joshua's decision to channel his grief into advocacy that gave Sunshine's death purpose beyond tragedy. His testimony before Congress was powerful and specific, combining personal experience with policy recommendations that could prevent similar incidents. Sunshine didn't die because she was a bad dog. She died because ignorance and prejudice made officers see threats where medical assistance was happening. Joshua told the House Veterans Affairs Committee during nationally televised hearings, "Her death can either be meaningless tragedy or catalyst for changes that protect other veterans and their service animals from experiencing what we went through." The federal civil rights settlement provided Joshua with $4.2 million in damages while funding comprehensive monitoring of Riverside police practices to ensure reforms were implemented rather than merely promised. The financial accountability sent clear messages about the cost of discrimination while providing Joshua with resources for recovery and advocacy. The education impact was immediate and lasting, with Joshua's story becoming required study in police academies throughout California, while his advocacy work influenced veteran service organizations and disability rights groups throughout the country. His transformation from victim to voice proved that trauma could be channeled into positive change when supported by community commitment to justice. The annual Sunshine Memorial Day became a national observance honoring service animals who died in service to their veteran partners, with events held throughout the country that educated communities about service animal partnerships, while raising funds for veteran assistance programs. The broader cultural transformation challenged fundamental assumptions about homelessness, military service, and the treatment of disabled veterans whose visibility made comfortable citizens uncomfortable. Joshua's experience forced recognition that veteran support required more than symbolic gestures. It demanded systemic changes that protected rather than persecuted those who had served. 5 years later, Joshua had become one of America's leading advocates for homeless veterans and service animal rights. His congressional testimony and community organizing having influenced federal policy while preventing similar tragedies through education and legal protection that Sunshine's death had made possible. The Sunshine Foundation, established with settlement funds and community donations, became the premier organization providing service animals to homeless veterans, while advocating for accommodation rights that protected vulnerable populations from institutional discrimination and violence. The final scene was both memorial and mission, as Joshua stood at the intersection where Sunshine had died, now marked with a memorial garden that honored service animals while educating passers-by about disability rights and veteran accommodation. The spot that had been scene of tragedy had become symbol of transformation. Sunshine died because people saw what they expected to see instead of what was really happening. Joshua reflected during the Memorial Gardens dedication ceremony. She was doing her job keeping me alive and functional, but they saw fraud and threat. Her death taught this community that veteran support isn't about parades and bumper stickers. It's about understanding that military service creates disabilities that require accommodation, not persecution. The audience, including Congressman Chin, federal officials who had prosecuted the officers' disability advocates, and hundreds of veterans and community members, understood that they were witnessing transformation of tragedy into triumph, proving that individual courage, supported by community commitment, could create institutional change that honored rather than betrayed the service and sacrifice of those who had protected America's freedoms. The Joshua Martinez and Sunshine tragedy became a watershed moment for veteran rights service animal protection and law enforcement accountability, establishing legal precedents and cultural changes that protected thousands of disabled veterans, while fundamentally transforming how American communities approached homelessness, disability, and the treatment of those who had served in uniform. The immediate consequences revolutionized police training nationwide, with the Department of Justice mandating comprehensive veteran accommodation education for all federally funded law enforcement agencies within 18 months. The program reached over 800,000 officers, while preventing countless incidents through enhanced understanding of PTSD service animal partnerships and the constitutional obligations that protected disabled veterans from discrimination and violence. The Sunshine's Law legislation created the first federal criminal penalties specifically targeting interference with service animals, with sentences up to 10 years in prison for law enforcement officers who violated accommodation rights. The law influenced state legislation throughout the country while establishing legal framework that protected service animal teams from institutional ignorance and violence. The federal court precedents strengthened enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, while creating new liability standards for police departments that failed to train officers in disability accommodation. The precedents influenced thousands of subsequent cases, while providing legal protection for disabled veterans who had been vulnerable to institutional discrimination. The Homeless Veteran Services transformation was equally significant, with Riverside's model being adopted by cities throughout the United States as communities recognized that punitive approaches to homelessness were both morally wrong and legally dangerous when applied to disabled veterans whose service had earned accommodation rather than persecution. The cultural impact challenged fundamental assumptions about homelessness and military service with Joshua's story, demonstrating that decorated combat veterans could lose everything to invisible disabilities while their needs were criminalized rather than addressed. The narrative influenced public policy and private charity approaches that emphasized housing and services over enforcement and removal. The service animal protection movement gained national momentum through Sunshine's death, with new legislation strengthening federal protections while increasing penalties for interference with working animals. The movement influenced international animal rights policy while creating partnerships between veteran organizations and animal advocacy groups. The research that emerged from documenting Joshua's recovery influenced academic understanding of trauma grief and the therapeutic value of human-animal partnerships. The findings contributed to VA treatment protocols while advancing understanding of how service-animal relationships enhanced veteran mental health and community integration. The economic development that resulted from Riverside's transformation attracted new businesses and residents who recognized the city's commitment to veteran services and disability accommodation. The model influenced urban planning throughout California, while demonstrating that inclusive policies created competitive advantages for communities committed to serving all citizens. The international influence extended to allied nations whose veteran services adopted similar accommodation protocols based on lessons learned from the American experience. The model influenced veteran support programs in Canada, Australia, and NATO countries, while establishing global standards for protecting disabled veterans and their service animals. The enduring message transcended individual tragedy to encompass fundamental truths about service and sacrifice. Military service created obligations for civilian society that extended beyond symbolic recognition to encompass practical accommodation. Service animals were medical equipment deserving legal protection, and the strongest communities were those that protected rather than persecuted their most vulnerable members.